chalice. Yeah, and we can just kind of make it another kind of informal, kind of a mingling session. So let's see here. First of all, before we get started, I want to try to take a picture. But everyone's kind of wide, so let's see. Actually, I've got most of you in there. That's probably as good as it's going to get. So, all right, good stuff. All righty. I need to stand off this thing. Okay, so maybe some of you have been here before. Maybe you're new to this area, but not being too mushy about this, but it's kind of sacred land to people in Idaho. This is, if there's a heart of Idaho, this might be it. This iconic backdrop behind me is pretty spectacular. I'd say it rivals that of just about any national park we might have here in the western U.S. And this, of course, is the Sawtooth Mountains. And I want to tell you a little bit about how the Sawtooths formed, the rocks that you see over there, and how this landscape has evolved a little bit over time. So we're here in central Idaho, and geologists divide up large tracts of land or big sections of real estate into geologic provinces. So where I live down in Twin Falls, I live in the Snake River Plain, an area with not much relief, a big river, lots of young volcanic rocks in the path of the Yellowstone hotspot that part of Idaho passed over. And we're obviously in a very different landscape than that. Here, this is the Central Mountain province of Idaho. It's kind of characterized by really big mountains, in places pretty big rivers, not a lot of highways that cut through this area, not a lot of people living in this region because it's pretty rugged, rough winters up here, you might imagine. And so this is a very unique part of Idaho that makes up sort of its core or its nucleus, if you will. And so we have a couple things going on here. So we have this jagged, serrated skyline here. That's hence the name the Sawtooths. And most of what you're seeing in terms of a landscape was carved by glaciers. So glaciers have a huge role to play here. And I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a bit. But whenever we go to some location, usually, not always, but usually there's two stories that are in front of you. There's the story of the rocks and there's the story of the landscape. Now in some places those actually merge together. If you go to Nick's favorite place, Craters of the Moon, the story of the rocks and the story of the landscape are all one because it's very young, it's very recent. Here though we have two different stories. So we'll start a little bit with the rocks. You can see the rocks here, kind of different shades of gray, lighter colored material. These are all part of mostly the Idaho batholith. So there's this large expanse of granites that formed as a large or several large bodies of magma that cooled underground. So almost all the rocks you're seeing in front of you were once miles below the Earth's surface. They were hot, they cooled, they crystallized, and then later they were uplifted to the surface and sculpted and modified by the glaciers. The Idaho batholith is what kind of makes Idaho unique in that it has this big central area that is a bit of an obstacle. We don't have a lot of north-south highways. If some of you tried to come down from the north to get to here, it wasn't easy. If you tried to come from the south going north, it's not easy. In fact, coming in any direction here is not easy, right? You got to take some squirrely little highway that follows the rivers to get up through here. And so it presents a pretty significant topographic barrier in this part of Idaho. And part of that is due to the geology. So we had in this area of Idaho during the Cretaceous, about 100 to 70 or so million years ago, we had a large amount of magma being generated here. Now, there's some controversy about what was going on there, and if you've watched some of Nick's shows over the past year, and the reason we kind of are here, what triggered that was some of the research and discussion going on about why that magma was even generated. The company line and sort of the story we've told each other over and over for years is that there was a big subduction zone that generated the magma. There was a series of volcanoes sitting above those magma bodies, and now the volcanoes have been eroded and you have these crystallized magma chambers. And I think we're starting to see that maybe it's not that simple. Maybe there's some other reasons why this area generated such large quantities of magma that later became granitic rock. So we can kind of explore those maybe informally, but nonetheless, we have this big swath of granite throughout central Idaho that forms during the Cretaceous. And then what you're also seeing up there, especially in some of the more iconic high peaks there, you're seeing another batch of magma that formed in the Eocene. So about 45 to 50 million years ago, after the Idaho batholith formed, in the same place where all this magma was that had solidified, there was another batch of magma that came up for very different reasons related to this episode called the Chalice magmatic event. That also produced volcanoes, and as you drive from here, towards Chalice, you'll see some of those volcanic rocks, especially right around Chalice. That's pretty much everything you're seeing around Chalice are either volcanic rocks or rocks related to those volcanoes. It could be, sandstones or some big petrified sequoia stumps over that way. And so that's what makes up some of these rocks as well, are these Eocene 50-ish million year old granitic rocks. Some of you went with me up Redfish Canyon on Thursday, and we got to see some of that up close and personal. That Eocene granite is much more pink. It's a little lighter in color. It's also a little bit more resistant. It's a little more, it doesn't break down as quickly as the Idaho batholith, so it makes a little bit better cliffs, and as a rock climber, it actually turns out to be a little bit better medium rock climbing. So we're seeing really here two types of magmas that have crystallized and solidified, now brought to the surface. The highest point you're seeing there, I think that's Thompson Peak, and there's a little, it's hard to see because the colors of the rocks are very similar, but there's a little sliver up there of what we call a roof pendant. Basically, as the magma rises and intrudes the existing rocks, the rocks that sit above that magma body, those can sometimes be preserved, and that's what you're seeing up there at that highest peak. There is a little bit of metamorphic rocks, mainly schists, that form that chunk of rock that sat above that magma body. So that's a little bit about the rocks we're seeing here, mainly granites for the most part, all across the Sawtooth Range. As you go into other mountain ranges in this part of Idaho, the rocks can change, especially as you go to the east. If you go further west, it's Idaho batholith from here over to Loman, through Garden Valley, and all the way over to McCall. So almost to the western margin of Idaho and the border with Oregon, it's this big swath of these granitic rocks that formed during that time. So that sets the stage a little bit for the rocks in this area. So let's talk about some other processes here. So the sawtooths are here and so dramatic because there's a large fault that runs along the base of the range. It's called the Sawtooth Fault. It's what we call a normal fault, so it's caused by extension. It's fundamentally part of this other big province we have to our south, but also kind of creeps up into this area called the Basin and Range. And this is an area that's undergoing more or less east-west extension caused by some complicated stuff with the plate boundaries. But this is what you see when you go down into Nevada and you have these alternating mountains and valleys and mountains and valleys, all the way up to Salt Lake City and the Wasatch Range, all the way west over to the Sierras and the Tahoe area. So some of those basin and range faults extend across the Snake River Plain into central Idaho. And so the Sawtooth Fault is a pretty prominent fault. We really didn't give it much credence, or well, it really wasn't researched much by geologists for a long time. And then something happened 5 years ago that kind of caught our attention. And this was March 31st of 2020. There was a magnitude 6.5 quake, maybe about 15 miles as the crow flies to the northwest, that shook this area. People down in Twin Falls where I live felt it. People in Boise felt it. No one died, no real serious damage for the most part, but that's a significant earthquake. And had that earthquake been in a more densely populated urban area, the damage could have been a lot worse. But it definitely caught geologists' attention as well. This is a pretty significant event, and maybe we should study this a little bit more. Interestingly, the location of the earthquake wasn't right here along the main front of the Sawtooth Fault. It was kind of off to the northwest, kind of beyond where we thought the fault ended. And so the speculation was, well, we thought the fault ended here. The epicenter's here-ish, so maybe the fault just goes a little bit further. But what's interesting is when we looked at the, some of you love the beach balls, right? Looked at the motion of the fault with the seismic waves that move through there and put that together in three-dimensional space, we saw that that earthquake was not generated by movement up and down like you would see on this type of fault, a normal fault that has vertical motion, but instead it had mostly what we call strike slip or horizontal motion. And so that was really confusing because this fault, in order to push those mountains up, needs to be moving this way. It needs to be dropping the valley down, pushing the west side where the mountains are up. And so the latest research, or a paper I just read about this from some folks that studied this, suggests that maybe that earthquake happened on another lesser known fault, or maybe a new fault that wasn't known in the area. So that's a bit of a concern because now we have the Sawtooth Fault, which research shows is capable of producing maybe as big as a 7, maybe 7.5 earthquake, which is very large. And now we have possibly another fault to the northwest that just produced a 6.5. So the seismic hazard was already pretty high for this part of central Idaho, but it's definitely maybe even more so elevated now with some of this research that's been discovered. But the faulting is what's allowed those mountains to rise, dropping the valley down. The mountains there are around 9,000 to 10,000 feet. So they're high, but not the highest in Idaho. If you go the next range over, which is past this skyline, are the White Cloud Mountains, which go up over 10,000, 11,000 feet. Then the next big range to the east is the Lost River Range, which is our largest mountains in Idaho, including Bora Peak, which goes up to 12,600 and some odd feet. And then you have the Lemhi Range and then the Beaverhead Range, which forms the border with Montana. So we have a whole series of these sort of northwest trending mountains. They go from here, there's 3 or 4 more of these going to the east till you get to the border with Montana. And those are all related to this extension. And we know it's still going on because we had the Bora Peak earthquake in '83. It was like a magnitude 7, big earthquake. 2 school children died in Chalice walking to school when bricks fell off a building. What's that? Oh, I thought I heard something. So, yeah.
How's that related to the Tetons?
It's the same. It's the same thing. Yeah. So the Tetons, the Wasatch, all these big mountains in east central Idaho, everything you see, the ranges in Nevada, the east side of the Sierras, all of that's part of this extension, this basin and range. And so the earthquakes are just evidence to us, along with GPS evidence, that the extension's still going on, that the process started 15 or so million years ago and continues today. So the Teton Fault, the Sawtooth Fault, Ron got me off of the Teton. Sawtooth Fault running through here. What's interesting about the Sawtooth, kind of turning the page a little bit to some of the other processes that have shaped these mountains. So we have the fault that's pushed the mountains up, that allows them to attain their height. But these aren't that big of mountains, right? I just told you the next range over, the White Clouds, has bigger peaks. And the next range over, the Lost River Range, has way bigger mountains. And yet the Sawtooth Mountains had the biggest glaciers. They were the most extensively glaciated. So we have huge glaciers that came out of these mountains and the high peaks, came down all the way onto the valley floor. This low ridge with all the trees here is actually a moraine from the Redfish Glacier, which is the largest one. It's about 9 miles long. And it came all the way across, and in some instances went across the valley and pushed up against these hills over here and cut off the Salmon River. The Salmon River starts at the south end of the valley, flows north, and there were times when the glaciers actually dammed up the Salmon River. It backed up into a lake. There were times that it cut through, and the glaciers, would come and go a little bit. But these glaciers were big, they were extensive. This is by far, other than where the ice sheet was in the panhandle of Idaho, this was the most extensively glaciated part of Idaho by far. But it begs the question, or asks the question, someone corrected me on how to say that correctly. It asks the question, why? Why would these mountains at 9,000 to 10,000 feet get so much snow that they have big glaciers when there's bigger mountains over there that had much smaller glaciers? And really has a lot to do with the weather systems here. As these Pacific storms track across Oregon into Idaho, and they run into the mountains north of Boise. They start rising. As they start rising with that orographic lift, they start dropping more snow. But the sawtooths are the first real topographic obstacle they run into. So those storms stall on these mountains, drop more snow, and as they head east, they've lost a lot of their moisture. So they're dropping snow on the White Clouds, but a little less. They're dropping snow on the Lost River Range, but a little less, and so on and so forth. So you'll see that when we go over to Chalice. When you look at the elevation of Chalice versus Stanley, it's maybe 1,000 feet. It's not that big of a difference, but Chalice will look very different than this area if you haven't seen already. It is one of the driest parts of Idaho, even though it's at a fairly high elevation. It is a desert landscape, and that's because of this rain shadow effect. So we got much bigger glaciers here because the snowfall was much higher here and still is higher here because of this sort of orographic effect and this rain shadow effect that happens off to the east. So the Lost River Range should have bigger glaciers, but the sawtooths are stealing all the snow, in essence. But nonetheless, yeah, go ahead, question.
What's driving the fall, and I guess does Yellowstone have any effect to this at all?
What's the first question, sorry?
What's driving the fault? What's
causing
causing that to go?
Yeah, the fault's part of this more or less east-west extension that's part of the
Right.
basin and range. And we
But
think
what's causing that?
The quick answer would be we think it might be related to, there's lots of models, but one model is that as the Pacific plate pulls away, it's moving to the northwest. I guess it goes backwards for you guys here. That's pulling on North America. So that's exerting an extensional force as the Pacific plate moves to the northwest at a fast rate. It's dragging this edge of Western North America with it. But there's other models that kind of speak to that.
Okay. How much time does it take to go from 2 or 3 miles deep to get up to here?
Yeah, good.
What's the time?
What are the rates? Right, good question. So you're really looking at, for all these mountains, Tetons, the Wasatch, the Lost Rivers, the Sawtooth, probably a good, like, just ballpark figure is imagining the stress building up in the rocks. The extension is trying to pull the rocks apart, but they resist because they have strength to themselves. And then at some point, it might take 100 years, it might take a couple thousand years. The strength of the force is greater than the rock strength, and you get an earthquake. And maybe like the Bora Peak earthquake produced about 10 feet of vertical offset in a split second, basically. And that was one event, right? So now imagine one event doing that, maybe 10 feet, you know, and then you got to build up stress again for another couple hundred years. So the rates here would be, so you're probably looking at 15 million years, maybe, at a rate of like a millimeter per year, right? The mountains are going up, and the faulting on average is maybe 1 millimeter per year, which is nothing, right? That's like the width of your pencil lead, but it's that cumulative time over geologic time, millions of years, then you get substantial results out of that.
Can you calculate the amount of erosion that's causing to come down off
Yeah.
too? So
Yep.
they have a kind of a bouncing effect?
Yeah, so we play games with that. That's called like exhumation. That's the fancy word we use, like how much material had to be removed along with the uplift to get these rocks, which form deep, to this level. I don't have any specific numbers in my head right now, but those can be estimated, you know, just roughly to some degree. Yeah, good question. Yeah, so the glaciers were here. The sawtooths were the big winners in the sort of snowfall sweepstakes in terms of getting the most snowfall. And as you go along the front of the sawtooths, you see a series of lakes. So Redfish Lake is the biggest one. It sits in one of these moraines. So this is the sort of terminal advance of one of these glaciers. And if you go down to Redfish, you'll see it's kind of rimmed by a high ridge of forests. The trees love the moraines. The trees love growing on the moraines, just the right combination of it's good permeability, lots of rock sizes and shapes, so they're well drained. So these are all moraines that come across the valley, and there's a whole series of these lakes at the bottom of the mountains where these glaciers once resided. So there were literally dozens of glaciers coming out of these down into the valleys. If you go up into the mountains, so if you're able to get up into the canyons in the mountains, that's where you see the effects of the glaciers, not as a product of deposition and dropping rocks like we see on the moraines, but that's where they were more erosional, and that's where the ice and the rocks embedded in the ice scoured the bedrock, polished it. If you're with me on Thursday, we saw places where there's really nice striations, and that's what gives the Sawtooth this sort of jagged, rugged skyline, is the effects of the glaciers just scouring and eroding the rocks over time. Let's see where else I got here. I think that's most of it. Questions? Yeah, a couple questions.
How long ago were the glaciers here?
So the glaciers probably peaked here maybe like 20, 15,000 years ago, the most recent advance. And then following about 15,000 years ago, the climate started warming, the glaciers started retreating. It's not like it was one wholesale retreat. There were probably some, wetter periods and cooler periods in there. But when was the last glacier up there? Before people were here, for sure. There's perennial snowfields up there now. There's probably a few of what we call rot glaciers, which is ice that's still present just below the surface in the big broken boulders, but it's not ice at the surface, but it's still ice that's moving. So we still have rot glaciers here, but Idaho no longer has any glaciers. Our last glacier was on the north side of Bora Peak. It was documented in the 80s. I think they went back a few years ago, and it's pretty much not there in terms of like being a what we would call officially a glacier. Yeah.
So these are basically lateral moraines coming off repeatedly on each side of the glacier from the peaks.
Right.
And also the other question, displacement on the strike slip
Fall to the north. It's right on one of Nick's shows, I'm sure. It's towards the northwest. And what was the amount of displacement on that?
From the recent earthquake?
Yes.
I don't know off the top of my head, but given it was a 6.5, you're probably looking at like a meter or so this much-ish. So
was it true clockwise rotation was more like the faults that run towards the north?
yeah, it's a northwest trending fault that had, I think it was right lateral, it had sideways motion, but it didn't break the surface. Usually 6.5 is about the limit where if you can get 6.5 or above, the fault will sometimes break the surface and we get what we call surface rupture. Like the Myanmar earthquake, if you saw that a few months ago, where it actually moved the ground and you can see that visibly at the surface. This one was just not quite energetic or big enough to produce any sort of surface rupture or any disruption to the surface that could be observed.
Is there any study on the fault here as far as being a normal fault? Does displacement along the normal fault towards the north? Is there, I mean, it's all buried in this valley.
Yeah.
So to analyze that, you have to find some exposure easy. But could that also be, besides the normal fault, also a fault that is kind of?
Yeah, I think it could be that we have a combination of motions. We talk about there being dip slip motion and strike slip motion, but a lot of faults are actually oblique slip, and so it's perfectly within the realm of possibility for one earthquake to produce mostly on the same fault to produce dip slip motion, and then a subsequent earthquake maybe to produce a little bit more sideways motion. And I don't know, I think most of the normal fault designation for the Sawtooth Fault is looking at the relief and the displacement. We can't really tell any sort of lateral movement because we don't have any markers. We would need something like on the San Andreas Fault, you can see stuff that's been offset, so you can see those markers. We don't have those markers here, so in the absence of that, all we can use are earthquakes happening in our time that we can analyze, study, and measure to see what the dynamics, what we call the kinematics of the movement are. Yeah.
Let me jump in here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Shawn Willsey, everybody. We're going to continue this, but let me add a few narratives, and then we'll just try to get as many voices involved as possible. We'll just try to keep this going. We'll make sure to repeat the question so you can hear what's going on. And when you've had enough, you've had enough. You don't feel like you have to stay here. But let's enjoy this crazy morning, this movie set-like morning that we have. Thank you so much for being here. There's a vibe when you get people together in person that we don't normally feel when we're staring into a camera in our office. So this is unique. This is a special thing. And when Shawn invited me to come over last summer, He said, why don't we make a few videos together in the field? I said, that sounds like a good idea. And I said, how about we do a couple of pop-up geology things where we just say we'll be at a certain town in a certain place. We'll see if anybody shows up. And that's a concept I had a few years ago in Washington, and I've been away from it for a while, but I'm remembering how special this is. So I think I want to go back to doing some of this pop-up geology thing when I get back home. But this is an away game for me. This is a home game for Shawn, and we're going to use a lot of his expertise. We're going to continue. I don't know, did you notice? Shawn started about 80 million years ago and worked his way towards present day. And I want to go back to 80 million years ago briefly, add a couple of personal things, and then I think we'll just keep this going. Let me tell you about the world 80 million years ago. So this is an away game for me, but I did go to graduate school in Pocatello, a few hours to the southeast of here. So I was up in here as a 23, 24, 25-year-old. So this is in the late 1980s, and we were taught by excellent geology professors that this was a volcanic arc, that these magmas that make up the Idaho batholith were for subduction of the Farallon plate, similar to the story for the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. We were literally taught that this is a continuation of the Sierra Nevada batholith down in eastern California. And full disclosure, here's the personal part. I've been teaching for a long time that the Idaho batholith was a northern extension of the Sierra Nevada batholith, and there was an offset. So this portion of the batholith was sent east, or you can think of California's batholith was sent west on the Basin and Range extension. But the point for a long, long time, as recently as the 1990s, is that this granitic batholith is the same thing as the California batholith. And if we go up that way to British Columbia, there's a continuation there as well. So it's a nice, pleasing, simple story. So I was pissed off when I started realizing that there's different generations of granite in one simple picture. So I'm going to give Shawn a few minutes to compose himself, but I'm hoping that we can literally, and if you need to stand up, great, to get yourself turned around. I want to use every peak and valley that we can see. Like, we're out here for real. This is not a classroom video. This is not a PowerPoint presentation. So I'm hoping to get more from Shawn and anybody else here that knows some detail about how to read this landscape. There's a lot of stories here within our field of view. I'll start based on what I just said. It's not all the same story, and you may have caught what Shawn said, but let me elaborate on that just a bit. Shawn, the highest peak is what again? The highest triangular peak? Thompson Peak. And so the light from my eyes shows that it's not all the same gray color. Am I looking, Shawn, at kind of a maroon smiley face a little bit below the peak? Is that the roof pendant? Do we know? You can say you. Okay? So the point that I want to make is that Thompson Peak and that massive granite off in this direction, what number did you want? 80? 75? Sure, 75. Just pick one number. 75 million-year-old granite, part of the Atlanta Lobe. And what I did last summer in preparation for coming over here, so the plan was we were going to be doing this in early September of last year. Maybe some of you were planning on coming then. I met some people from the UK who visited my office in September, and I'm like, what? They're like, we came over for that thing with Willsey, and then you canceled it. We had our plane tickets anyway. So that's the reach of these YouTube channels. So anyway, I was doing an Idaho mini-series to prepare myself for all this new stuff, because I was basically asking, is this an old volcanic arc like I was taught 30 years ago? Pretty quickly, with each geologist I was visiting with, the answer was no, 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 no. There's all these different stories. So, 75 million-year-old granite, that half of the skyline.
Plain boy.
Plain boy. But the major scoop, the major divot in the skyline, that's Redfish Canyon. So in the neighborhood of Redfish Canyon and those jagged peaks to the south, to the left, that's 45 or 48 million year old granite. You're like, oh, that's cute. I didn't know there was a difference. To me,
That's worse than before.
that's worth it. To me, I always, and I don't know if you want to go here too, but it's the tectonic story that is associated with those two different kinds of granite. 75, 45, let's do that. 75 million year old granite, 45 million year old granite. In the same mountain range. They're both granites, but here's the difference. 75 million year old granites are from a compressional story, not with a subducting plate, but with a thickening crust. And Shawn, in his interview with me, got me going on this. You want to speak right now? Why did you think it wasn't? What questions did you have in that Zoom interview that we did that intrigued you about maybe something was up with your understanding of the Idaho Basin?
Yeah, just a few questions I posed to Nick in that interview, if you watched, was that I was just confused with. I don't consider myself an expert on it, but to call something an arc, you know, usually it's a curvature on the Earth's surface. It's a chain of volcanoes. When you say a volcanic arc, my brain goes to, you know, the Caribbean or the Aleutians or something like that. That's a volcanic arc, and it has two components. It has the subsurface magma storage zones, you know, where the magma resides, and that's eventually cools into granite or something like that. And then it has a surface component, a surface expression, which are the volcanoes themselves. And for the Sierras, for all this younger granite, the 45 million year old material, we have that. We have the surface volcanoes, we have ash deposits, we have things that the volcanoes erupted onto the landscape that are still preserved. But to my knowledge, there's no evidence that I've heard of for these batholith granites, these older 75 million year old granites, having any sort of surface volcanic expression. So before we call it an arc, do we know for sure that there were volcanoes above this magma body? And the other big question I had with Nick was, at the same time this is happening, you know, at this latitude, this is the story. These are the rocks. But if you go into Canada, into the Canadian Rockies, or you go south into Utah and Wyoming, the story at 75 million years are a series of thrust faults. We're thickening the crust. There's a big mountain building event going on called the severe orogeny. And so you can't, in my mind, throw this and make this a volcanic arc without taking into account the other event that was going on in this region from north to south, which was this big crustal thickening event, which was the severe orogeny.
So the bottom line is, thank you, Shawn, I was taught a subducting plate generated this granite. Turns out the 75 million year old story and the 45 million year old story, neither of them have a subducting ocean plate. Classically, a volcanic arc is a subducting plate, like the Cascades up where I live. We all know that's geology 101. So how do you make the 75 million year old granite? You crank down on the crust here. You make it thick, thick, thick. You over thicken it, and you generate magmas in that stack of over thickened crust, like in the Himalayas today. And why doesn't it extend north to California or to Canada? And why doesn't it go south to California? Because this is a localized squeezing. Some geologists have been doing some work in western Idaho. They have faults, they have strike slip faults back 75 million years ago, and we were flipping or rotating the crust 75 million years ago into the central Idaho area to generate these magmas. That's a lot of magmas just from squeezing and thickening the crust. I still struggle with that a little bit. But the fact we don't have a deep source, we don't have a line of beautiful Mount Rainier cones is a story. Then we jump to the 45 million year old magmas. That's not diving plate either. That's, as Shawn was just saying, extending the crust, pulling it apart like an accordion, and having magmas coming up, not only here, but from here all the way to Seattle. Blotches of Eocene magmas that have no line, they have no arc pattern. And so the obvious question there is, why are we extending the crust so dramatically 45 million years ago? And if you've been following some of the interviews I've been doing, there's a lot of stuff happening around the rim of the Pacific Ocean 50 to 45 million years ago that perhaps is influencing a bunch of magmas coming up in this scene. Okay, I want to lead a little bit more with our 360 view with Shawn guiding us, and then I'd like to moderate this and just keep these questions coming and get as many different voices as possible. Okay? So, Shawn Willsey, can you give us, with the granite stuff, how is it just the 45 and 75 million year old granites viewed that way? Or is any of this stuff over here or to the north an extension of those two granites?
Yeah, so both granites do extend a little bit to the east. So if you look more or less north here through the parking lot, now everyone's turning around, that's fun.
That's great. Oh, yeah, stand up, please.
The craggy outcrops just north of town, that's all Idaho batholith. And as you drive from here up Highway 75 towards Chalice, as many of you are, along the Salmon River, probably the next, definitely from here to Sunbeam, which is a little mining community up towards Custer, and a Yankee Fork area. That's all Idaho batholith. Maybe another 6-7 miles beyond that, Idaho batholith. And then as you go beyond it, it changes, but that's not within our view. So this is all Idaho batholith here. Everything looking now more towards the northwest past that cabin is probably Idaho batholith. And then once you get into the hills where the fire was here and looking at the skyline, it's Idaho batholith probably until you get to about this house with the green roof over your left shoulder, Nick. From about there-ish to the south, then you start getting more of the younger granite, the 45 million.
All right, let's do a few more. This is great, Shawn. Jumping to the Ice Age, less than 2.6 million years ago. All these forested bumps in the foreground, extending all the way up to the base of the granites. You think that's all glacial, or are there landslides, or are there other young stories making up? Why are all these bumps here? Why isn't it just a Jackson Hole big ka-chunk and the floor is dropping and the range is lifting?
I think it's mostly glacial. I think, there's definitely mass wasting and rockfall events as well, but as far as I know, there's no significant slides that come out very significantly away from the mountains. You can see 3 glacial troughs right here in front of us, just to the left of this small little building with the white trim. You can see where the glaciers came down. Maybe those ones had limited area, so you can see they're not tapping a very big area, so they were pretty small glaciers, came down about that far, and then you end up with some of the bigger glaciers like Redfish, which goes way back into the mountains, have several tributary glaciers feeding it. But yeah, this is mostly moraine material, and I'm speculating here, but maybe you don't see that abrupt mountain front. That might speak a bit to the Teton Fault being much more active versus the Sawtooth Fault maybe not being as active. And so an active fault is going to give you a steeper escarpment. It's even going to fault your glacier deposits over time and give you that abrupt change in slope. And maybe this is more subdued because this fault isn't as active as the Teton Fault.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, we're going to keep this going, and if you want to join us in the town of Chalice, over that way, it's literally 60 miles.
Something like
that. We'll do the same kind of, like, why would I go to the evening show? I went to the morning show. Why would I go to the evening show? Well, one thing we're going to do differently is I'm hoping we can do the same thing and do our 360 thing and see how different it looks over there, and maybe look for some parallel stories between what's over there and what's over here. But the fact that we all took the time and energy and cost to get here, I think we want to really maximize this spot. I have one more question and then we're going to go to you. You mentioned these glaciers were so big and they came down into this valley, flowing essentially to the east. Do you think they were big enough to totally block this valley? And what were the implications of that if that's true?
You can definitely see, I think it was the Redfish Glacier, you can see the moraine. The moraine at its terminal end up against these hills is gone because the river's cut through it. But you can see its margin coming very, very close. Even when you drive to Redfish Lake, you know, the hills to your left on the east are very close. And as you turn up Redfish Creek, the moraine's right there. So it absolutely came across. It dammed up the Salmon River. There hasn't been a lot of research on this that I'm aware of, so there's not a lot of great details here. But I have heard there are some lake deposits further south in the valley that would go with that story. The glacier moving across the valley, right up against and abutting the hills to the east. That doesn't allow the Salmon River, which is small at this point, right? We're in the headwaters of it, but that river can't get through on its path to the north. It rises and it probably goes over the moraine and it cuts back down through it. I don't know if that happened once or repetitive times. I don't think it was, I think our brain goes to, wait, glacier, water, outburst floods, right? Like we're thinking something big like channeled scablands. I don't know that there was anything dramatic that happened there. But the glaciers absolutely came down to the valley, and at least in one location, and maybe more, went all the way across the valley to the hills on the other side.
Beautifully done, beautifully done. Geologist Sky Cooley surprised us last night, so he came down on his motorcycle. Say hi to Sky, please. And let's open it up to you guys. Yes.
A basin and range question.
Basin and range question.
We know it started around 16 million years ago.
Okay.
Did it start at the east side, the west side, the middle, or all at once?
Thank you. The question is, basin and range extension, we're mostly down in Nevada and western Utah. We're between Salt Lake City and Reno, Nevada. A bunch of normal faults that have been active, making earthquakes, and opening the crust like an accordion. The question is, how about the timing of that? Did it start in the middle, on the edges, or everything else? Can you tell I'm stalling? I'm just repeating the question.
Can you restate the question again?
So, I thought a lot about the basin and range extension 40 years ago when I was a grad student. We didn't have the timing down at that time, 40 years ago, on how to tease out which faults were younger than which to ultimately give that answer. Do you have anything to say about this?
I always have something to say. Yeah, so the basin and range is complicated. The basin and range is different in different places. So if you're down where Elaine and Ron live in Tucson, Arizona, that extension starts a lot earlier than it does in Nevada, maybe even than it does up here. So it's a big area, and so the extension's not necessarily starting at the same time across the board. I guess the only way to consider how it started is we can look at like somewhat modern corollaries, areas in the world that are similar, and see what's happening there. It's not a plate boundary, but it's behaving like it wants to be at some point. Like it really wants to be a plate boundary at some point. It's an area of diffuse extension, so it's an area of extension, but broadly. You know, it's not like concentrated. So I don't know the definitive answer to your question, but in my mind, what I picture is a region, maybe, I don't know, 40 miles wide, a pretty narrow zone with faults that start extending, and then you just grow from that point. So I guess you could reconstruct, if you pulled Reno over to Salt Lake City and close the basin and range, and then allow the tape to run forward, that would kind of be the idea. I've actually seen reconstructions where they undo basin and range extension, and Nevada goes from looking like this to looking like this.
About half the distance.
Yeah, even less than that, yeah. So there's been so much extension. Yeah, it's about half, you're right, so.
Back in the day, we thought the Teton Fault was the youngest, and it wasn't an accident that it was right on the margin, the northeastern margin of the whole scene. I don't know if that's changed, but that was the thought. Let's keep it going. Yes?
I have a question about the Idaho batholith versus the sawtooth pluton. The rock colors are so different. What accounts for the high amount of feldspar, I guess, in the Sawtooth Pluton compared to the Idaho batholith?
Question about the difference between the two granites, the 75 million and the 45 million. There's a color difference. Elaine was out with Shawn, and you must have been talking about some specific differences between the 75 and the 45.
Yeah, so you can pick them apart pretty easily in hand sample. If you get a roadside book with a nice picture of classic Idaho batholith, classic sawtooth granite. Elaine's right that the sawtooth granite is a little bit pinker in color because it has a lot more potassium feldspar, this pink mineral. It also has a lot more coarse grain, so it has bigger crystals, which probably speaks to its cooling rate to some degree. Why it has more, does it really have, it may not be, Elaine, that it has more potassium feldspar, they're just bigger. And so they dominate more of the area that you're looking at. Because I think the chemistries aren't that different. You know, they're not, I think the sawtooth is a true granite and the batholith has tonalites and some other types. They both have the same components more or less, but the feldspars grew quite large in the sawtooth granite, and that probably is what dominates the color difference.
Thank you.
This is fun. Yes?
So I have sort of a conceptual misconnection about figuring out, I can see in a compressional situation, mountain ranges over thickening and going up.
Yeah.
In an extensional thing, and we think of, again, the Tetons being very young and rising and gaining in elevation, even though we're in an extensional thing. I was thinking of extension. Certainly the grobens, the valley bottoms drop, but how come the horse or the mountains are rising when it's being pulled apart?
Thank you. I'll try. Did you hear the question? Talking about it makes sense if you compress the crust, why you'd have a big, thick, beautiful piece of crust and a high mountain range. But if you're pulling the crust apart, we're making mountains go up when you're pulling the crust apart. My general sense, or the way that I would like to typically address something like that, is isostasy. Is the idea that you keep a mass balance. If you're dropping crust in an area, you're also lifting crust to maintain a balance. Overall, you're thinning the crust as you extend. Basin and range, and I think probably during the crazy Eocene as well, we're overall thinning the crust as we extend. But within that thinning of the crust, we've got these dominoes that are tilting, and one end of the domino is going up and the other is going down. We get into physics and math pretty quickly, and I kind of zone out.
My 2 cents, Carl, on that are, you're right, because you go to like Salt Lake City, here's the big Wasatch Mountains or the Tetons or whatever, and it's always a question of, well, did everything drop? Was everything at a higher level? And here's a piece of crust on one side of the fault that's 8 foot while everything dropped, or did everything get pushed up? And really, it's a combination. And with the Borer Peak earthquake, we had the benefit of knowing what the elevation was before and after. And I think the numbers, and don't quote me on these, were a cumulative displacement of about 10 feet, with the valley dropping about 7 and the mountainside going up about 3. So it was both up and down motion in that one instance. And so that tells us that, okay, mountains you can push that footwall side up during an extensional event.
Thank you. Again, if you've had enough, thanks for coming. But we're going to go for a bit more. We got too much energy here. Positive, good energy. Yes.
So it's not that the whole valley floor dropped on both sides. It's a rotational thing. But they're half droppings.
Yes. When I showed up from Wisconsin and started studying in Idaho, I was taught back in Wisconsin that you have Horst and Graben labels, that you have a valley like this and you have a major normal fault on both sides of the valley, and so the crust is just dropping vertically and the ridges are going up. My master's thesis turned out to be on half Graben work, where we're not doing a up and down, but we're doing a bunch of dominoes that are tipping over, 3 at a time if you want.
Pizza boxes.
Yeah.
Well, the pizza boxes I was using were the thrust vaults doing this.
Reverse pizza boxes.
But it's the tilting thing, so the half Graben thing, you're right. So my advisor was fresh out of Stanford, Dave Rogers, and he was just a couple years older than me, and I was his first grad student. And we went out the first time, and he says, well, what's your explanation for this valley? And I did the whole grabbing thing with normal faults on both sides. It was in front of about 40 other students. You know, it was a different time. He basically wanted to embarrass me, I think. And so then everybody's like laughing at the end, like, this guy thinks there's a fault on both sides of the valley. He hasn't even heard about this half-graben thing. So that was in the works, mostly from Stanford people in the 1980s, to understand that there's only really one. Most of these basins just have one normal fault on one side. You can go to the other side of the valley, you can't find a normal fault. So that classic picture in a Geology 101 textbook from 1975 doesn't work for most of these valleys. Let's do some more. Yes?
I got a question on timing and use time. The extension basin range you said started 17 million years ago. Is that right?
Something like that.
Yeah. Well, then how? I thought we were talking about the sawtooths being part of the basin range, but they happened much earlier.
Okay, well, let me try, Shawn, and then
Yeah, go ahead.
go for it.
Yeah, you're fine.
So it is confusing. You talk about a concept of crustal extension or even transtension, where we're pulling apart and also sliding some stuff north. It gets confusing when you realize that there's many different times in history when that's going on. So the basin and range to make these valleys and ridges that we're talking about is younger than 17. But the 45 million year old granite, that's a much older time when we're doing some sort of similar extension from a totally different tectonic story. And that's a Pacific Northwest, at least, story, which started and then stopped. That extension stopped roughly 45 million years ago, and all these quote-unquote chalice magmas stopped coming up between the Black Hills and Seattle. So, yeah, I mean, you can find these. It's almost like you go to a theater performance and there's like motifs run through the whole production. They establish something and then it goes away and then it comes back after the second act. It's kind of that here, this whole grand drama, and there's these, if we're just thinking of extension, there's these different chapters that are extension, but it's not an ongoing thing. Yes?
So the rate of uplift of the mountains over the millennia, has it been faster at some times and slower at others? Do we have any way of knowing that?
Thank you. Uplift rate. Green shirt, go.
I feel like I should be moderating, and then I can punt all the hard questions. I'm not, I mean, I don't know the latest. If that's been calculated, I'm not aware of it. Those are sometimes hard. You got to have markers and time components, so getting that data is sometimes tricky. So I don't know if it exists. I would like to think that the uplift rate probably is not consistent. Certainly, you know, with faulting, that's usually true anyway. You might have periods of time where basin and range extension, you know, down south of the plain in the Albion Mountains near where I live was really fast from like 10 to 6, and then it slowed down, and now it's kind of like barely there. And so you probably have some different rates going on here. As the glaciers have retreated and melted, you might have seen some accelerated rate. You've taken mass off the mountains and gotten rid of it completely. So you might see a little bit more rebound and faster rates of uplift with the glaciers moving out.
It's tricky, you know, we've been looking at this for about 100 years, and something with that much detail just in the last couple of decades, and all you can do as a geologist is take a rate that you can see now and assume that's been the constant rate through time until you can somehow figure out a way to realize that the rates were changing. But it's tricky. Yes?
The crustal thickening event that occurred about 75 million, was that related to the arrival of the the insular terrain in Brangelia? I mean,
Nick, I'll give that one to you.
Thank you. So
Repeat the question.
Yes, the question involves the 75 million year old granite and this thickening, this orogenic plateau, as it's called. So we just have so much thickened crust that we have maybe an elevated plateau throughout much of Idaho at this time. And the question is, what can we tie that to besides just saying it's squeezing? Many of you know that to the west of here, on the other side of that range, it gets funky in a hurry, and there's a lot of different kinds of bedrock, and many of the pieces of bedrock have nothing to do with who they're next to. Exotic terrains or accreted terrains or fruitcake is. So the idea is the accumulation and the addition of a bunch of those foreign pieces of land to the edge of North America. Some of it came together as an intermontane terrain, another came together as an insular superterrain. There's a lot of different labels and everything else. Generally, the thickening is happening younger than most of the accretion. Even the insular stuff, depending on who you talk to, let's go with basal kickoff. 100 million years ago, we collide and we gain most of our real estate. But remember, our squeezing is happening 75. So what's happening 75 million years ago? Baja, BC. Now, come on now. So if you're unfamiliar with this concept, the idea that major amounts of this real estate moved north after it got accreted continues to be a fringe idea, but I'm definitely part of the lunatic fringe, and one of the leaders of the lunatic fringe was Shawn's advisor at Northern Arizona, Paul Umhofer, and so I continue to lean in to these major scale things. Robert Hildebrand just sent me a brand new paper. I haven't even looked at it yet, but people are continuing to work on these major amounts of crustal movement. And to me, it's more and more difficult to ignore these major stories about movement of the crust. It's all, bite-sized and digestible when we're just talking about stories, within a field of view. But I get turned on if you've got stuff in a field of view and it was all 2,000 miles south. Or there's a matching set of this stuff up in the Yukon. That's where I get going. And I love that stuff. Yes,
okay,
best seats in the house.
I've been confused. This crustal compression is east-west, correct? But Baja, BC is north-south.
Right. So both stories are happening at the same time. The question is, are we really squeezing east-west? And are we really going north-south at the same time? Generally, yes. So the idea is, if you want to parse them out, I think the east-west squeezing is maybe 100 million years ago when we collide with this massive piece of crust that was out in the water. And then that's the hit. And then the hit and run model that we're talking about right now. The run is the movement north. But when you really get into the details of many of these faults, there's both going on. Pression, squeezing, and working to the north. So it doesn't work easily with a person's brain, but it's easy to just ignore one of the vectors and just tell an accordion story, which is what I've been taught for a long time. But I think it's time to start involving that other, like take the accordion
and then rip it apart.
Yes.
Tying all this together as best as I can, anyone ever do geomag on the location of those mountains back 75 million? Was it part of an island arc that came to North America and could have been totally related to something slightly different than what you're saying, and then going to all of the basin and range from the Gulf of California up to here? 15 million years ago, where was Yellowstone? You have...
Okay, I don't think we're going to go to Yellowstone now. Let me take the first half of your question. Thank you. So, paleomagnetic study is what got this whole concept of moving things thousands of miles north. That's when it started. A guy named Merle Beck at Western Washington University. So he started drilling holes in the granite in Southern California and using paleomagnetic data suggested that granite crystallized much further to the south. That was his PhD. Then he got a job at Western Washington in 1970. And the first thing he did was drill holes in the granite up by where I live, the Stewart Range, and Leavenworth and Ellensburg. He found the same signature. And he started drilling into all sorts of granites he could find in the neighborhood of 90 million years ago. They all showed the same thing. These are granites from Mexico, crystallized down there and they moved north. To answer your question, Merle started coming to Idaho, and colleagues came to Idaho, and they're like, let's drill into the 75-million-year-old stuff. Let's get the signature here. And that was a big moment for me last September when I interviewed Basil Tikoff, and I said, how come Merle or anybody didn't have paleomag from this set of granites right here? And he said, the chemistry is wrong. You have an unfortunate situation where these 75-year-old magmas, 75 million-year-old magmas, don't have the magnetite bearing or the iron bearing minerals to figure out the ancient latitude of the rock. So because of the minerals that are in this rock here, the paleomag doesn't exist for the Idaho batholith. If you go over to the western Idaho shear zone, those are older granites that do have the right paleomag. So it would be, I think, a very exciting thing if these happen to have paleomag signatures that fit into the story, but you can only work with what you're given.
But isn't the 706 line over there? I mean, is that still valid then?
The question involves the 706 line, which is basically shorthand for saying, isn't the edge of the craton of North America west of here? So why are we even talking about this portion of Idaho moving north? Shouldn't it be everything west? Okay, now we're into the radical stuff. You ready?
You're not ready.
This is going to sound like a major detour, but it's not. Glacier National Park, the Belt Supergroup. Many of you, you're all geology fans. You've been to Glacier Park. You know that there's a bunch of basically coastline, fine-grained sediments, collectively called the Belt Supergroup, and they're very, very old. They're pre-Cambrian in age, the old shoreline of old North America. These radical folks are saying that that whole package of coast rocks that everybody has been talking about as the edge of North America, inland of the 706 line, actually has a major boundary running right through it. And half of the Belt Supergroup was out in the water. And the other half of the Belt Supergroup was old-fashioned North America. And so this major boundary, this is where I'm going mentally, this major boundary that separates old North America that didn't do all this movement north, and the boundary on the other side with everything moving north, includes the 706 line, includes the Belt Supergroup, at least part of it, because the Rocky Mountain... Get up in space and look down in British Columbia. What's the most obvious feature you see from space? The Rocky Mountain Trench. It's a trench. It's a literal trench. It's a major structure. And Robert Hildebrand and a few others that are way out there, but I'm definitely listening to what they're saying. They're saying that's the boundary. Everything west of the Rocky Mountain Trench moved north. All these granites of a certain age are saying that. But you can't follow the Rocky Mountain Trench into Montana. It disappears into this collection, and that's the conundrum. Why does it disappear? Why can't we follow it down through this country? Yeah, definitely hijack this now.
No, you got
Shawn, you're going to cut us off when you want to cut us off. Way in the back.
Yes, hi you guys. First of all, thank you. This is totally awesome. Thanks so much for coming here.
Thank you.
I guess my question is going to bring it back a little more locally.
Good.
Talking about seismic activity in this area, recently there's been an awful lot of seismic activity of smaller magnitude. And there's been a lot of press on it about earthquake swarms going on here. Maybe this tilts a little bit more towards Shawn, but any insights into that activity, types of faults, any relations to the Sawtooth faults, etc., if you've been looking at it?
Yeah, I've been looking at it. Talked with Zach, who's at the Idaho Survey, does good work on the faults and such. It's weird. That's maybe the best way to start with what's going on there. It's odd, it's weird. So to clarify, usually what we see with an earthquake is a main event. Sometimes there's foreshocks, but usually not. There's a big earthquake, energy's released, and then as that fault sort of adjusts into its new configuration and setting, then you get a series of aftershocks. And the aftershocks usually follow a nice exponential progression where they start out, there's a lot of a lot of aftershocks initially, and you can get big aftershocks initially, but as more time goes on, there's fewer and they get smaller. That's the classic model. That works for probably 80% of the earthquakes out there. Big earthquake, trailing smaller aftershocks. Then we get these things like these seismic swarms, like the one we've had here on a small scale. There was another one in 2017 down near Soda Springs. There was one this year over in Santorini off the coast that got a lot of publicity. Those are a little different. So those seismic swarms are characterized by more sustained earthquakes of similar magnitudes over some protracted period of time. Might be a couple days. Santorini's went on for like 3 weeks, something like that. So the ones here, it's too early for us to say anything definitively. They seem to be on not the Sawtooth Fault again, but this other fault system. So really, I guess the benefit of the March 2020 quake is it's given us more data and information about where these other faults are. Faults are hard to map. You know, if it's in Death Valley and they're very recent, not so hard. But faults can be difficult to map when you've got a blanket of glacial debris over the top of it and forests. The Sawtooth Fault, interestingly enough, wasn't even actually like solidly identified and really described, I think, until like the 90s or something. So it went kind of undetected, even though there's like this abrupt topographic expression, and they had to use LiDAR and some advanced technology to actually see through the trees, and then they're like, oh, we can see a fault scarp here. There's clear evidence that there's a fault. But getting back to your question, it could be sometimes with these seismic swarms, what's causing them, and I'm not saying this is definitively the case, is it could be fluid movement. So you get fluids, could be hydrothermal, could be maybe not so hot water, moving along the faults themselves, sort of lubricating them, and then you can generate earthquakes. You know, it's sort of like the fluids move through the fault, and the fault reaches its critical point, and it pops and it breaks, and there's an earthquake. And then, but now the fluid rushes up a little further, you know, and then it pops and it breaks, and there's another earthquake of similar size, magnitude, location, and that can cascade domino effect style for days, weeks, months sometimes. And so the recent activity here, I don't know that that's the case. We might figure it out, we might not, but at least it's a hypothesis. At least it doesn't look at all like what we saw in March 2020, which was more of a classic main shock aftershock sequence.
That's kind of like fracking, putting
kind of, yeah, in a way. It's fluids.
Yeah, fluids, yeah.
I'd like to ask Sky Cooley, if you could,
yes,
follow up on Nick's thing. Why the trench stops in Montana? You're a Montana guy. You know more about Montana than anybody. No question.
I don't have a good answer for that. I think that trench has been modified by glacial ice, and so it appears as a topographic feature that's 1,000 miles long, but I don't know why it stops in Montana. I think a lot of things changed just south of the border in general with the bedrock geology, but I don't have a good answer for that at all. The Lewis and Clark line might have something to do with it. I don't know. There's some sort of boundary that occurs there just south of Glacier National Park. Might be the Lewis and Clark line. I'm not sure. I don't have a good answer.
It's tricky. It's unsatisfying to. There's literally some published work saying that major structure shape shifts and is some of these major pizza boxes or thrust faults, and that there's north-south movement on these flattish faults. That's not very satisfying, but it's a major dilemma, obviously. But the paleomag extends so far inland that I'm starting to go there. Let's just do a few more. Sauber.
Yeah, I'm wondering, since it's in the local area, it may not be geographic time-wise relevant, but does the western Idaho's shear zone have any impact on like the building up of the terrain that created the magmas?
I'll try, Shawn.
We're all trying.
The western Idaho shear zone is over close to Oregon, so the Idaho-Oregon state line. And it's a very complicated area, and I think of this geologist from Wisconsin, Basil Tikoff, when I think of the western Idaho shear zone, over by McCall and Riggins and so on. The story there is compression and a volcanic arc. So if we're desperate for a subducting plate and a true line of volcanoes, we have to go back more than 100 million years ago to find that. and those rocks are compressed and sheared. So there's the compression and the shearing, totally destroying those rocks in their original form. This field trip we did 2 years ago over there with Basil, right before a Penrose conference, people were like, I can't quite see the scale of, where's the volcanic arc? He said the volcanic arc, which was 100 miles wide, has been compressed down to like 3 football fields. Like you just, and they put it in a trash compactor. So that's an older story to me, and I don't see the connection to here. It's maybe setting the table for some of this work here locally.
Yeah, I think was your question more about like, do we see the effects here locally in the Stanley area?
I'm more wondering whether there was a relationship between events here and there, but also recognizing that the geologic time might not match up because I can't put the puzzle pieces together.
Yeah, I think the shear zone's far enough away that you're so far, I think, inboard on the continent that I would speculate that there was very minimal effects of that. All the action's in the vise over there by Riggins, and these rocks are strong and competent enough that they're not transmitting a lot of that stress very far. That would be my guess.
This guy Basil chose the Western Idaho shear zone 25 years ago because he thought that was the Baja BC fault. And this big boundary was everything west of Idaho. And after 20 years of work, he realized there's some movement, but not nearly enough to explain all this wild stuff. So he also agrees we have to go east to find a structure like that. Uh-oh. Shawn, is that your table full of books?
Yeah, but I think they're just
I think this is a good time to quit. If you want to talk one-on-one, of course, come on up. And then if you've got, what do you have for sale over there, Shawn? Your book?
There's some books if people want to get them. 25 bucks each. A couple maps I brought.
Wonderful.
Map. I think we're good. It's going to stay in that little section.
How many people are coming to Chalice? Almost everybody? Okay. We'll see you all this afternoon.
As you head over to Chalice, there is a geothermal